All right, so Joe Heschmeyer recently put out a video responding to an argument that Protestants have made for a long time concerning Irenaeus and apostolic tradition. And I was actually pretty excited to see him address this because this is actually one of those examples that comes up quite a bit in various Protestant Catholic discussions. And basically the issue is this. Irenaeus believed that Jesus lived into his late 40s. And what makes this particularly interesting is that he doesn't simply present this as one of his own personal interpretations. No, he connected this specifically to apostolic tradition, saying that this belief was handed down to him by the elders who were appointed or knew the Apostle John himself. Now, Protestants have historically looked at that claim and said, okay, if Irenaeus can believe that something came from the apostles and got that something wrong, then what does that ultimately tell us about how we should evaluate later claims of apostolic tradition? Because you're going to find multiple claims to apostolic tradition all over the place in church history. And I know Joe thinks this argument in this video doesn't ultimately work in the final analysis. Now, before I give any other commentary as to what I think about Joe's response here, I actually want to let Joe frame this issue in his own words.
Clearly, there are still Protestants making this argument 500 years later, and it's easy to see why. At first glance, it really does seem like Irenaeus is citing to false information about Jesus and claiming that this false information is apostolic tradition. I mean, he argues that Jesus died in his 40s, and he seems to say that this is taught both by the gospel and all the elders, and that those who were conversant in Asia with John, the disciple of the Lord, affirm that John conveyed to them that information. So if you're a Protestant like James White or these guys at Founders, it looks like an excellent argument about why we should not trust tradition.
And so he taught that Jesus was an old man when he died. And he claimed this was taught to him by the apostles. This is an apostolic tradition. That Jesus was more than 50 years old when he died. Nobody, East or West, actually believes that. But that's the earliest example of quote-unquote apostolic tradition in the early church.
But I think these Protestants maybe don't appreciate how serious this argument is, because it doesn't just look like an argument against the reliability of apostolic tradition. If you take it seriously, it looks, at least on the surface, like an argument against the reliability of Christianity itself.
Now, I actually think that's a pretty fair framing of the basic concern. But I still want to make sure that we're very precise about what the Protestant argument actually is, because our argument is not simply, look, Irenaeus got something wrong in church history. No, we know that Irenaeus is infallible. If all that happened here was that Irenaeus read John chapter 8, came to a bad conclusion about Jesus' age, and then, of course, got it wrong, then honestly, I don't think there would be much of an argument here. I think you can honestly chop up the Protestant concern as merely a wash. No, the thing that makes this example particularly interesting is that Irenaeus doesn't merely say, this is how I interpret the Gospel of John. No, he claims that this information was connected to the elders who had known the Apostle John and that John had personally conveyed it to them, right? And so that's the real reason that I think Protestants are asking, well, can somebody sincerely believe that they are preserving apostolic tradition and still be wrong about what that tradition actually teaches? I think that's a fair question, because if the answer is yes, then merely saying this came from the apostles cannot be the end of the conversation, right? We still have to evaluate the claim. All this establishes is that we have a beginning point that we need to kind of work our way to establish the basis for. Now, Joe spends a lot of time in the video explaining how Irenaeus may have arrived at this conclusion, right? He talks about John chapter 8, the chronology of Jesus' ministry, ancient categories for different stages of human life, and a possible tradition coming from Papias. And honestly, some of that is really, really interesting. I actually enjoyed watching the video, and I would actually encourage you to go watch Joe's entire video if you want the full argument that he lays out. I think it's pretty good. But I'm honestly not going to respond to every single detail here because I don't think it's necessary. You see, for the sake of argument, I'm willing to grant Joe all of that. Let's say Irenaeus had a reasonable biblical argument to present, right? Let's say there actually was an earlier tradition behind what he was saying. Let's even say Joe is completely right about how Irenaeus eventually misunderstood that tradition. Let's grant him all of that. The central fact still remains, though, my friends. Irenaeus still believes something that Joe himself acknowledges was mistaken. And Irenaeus specifically connected that mistaken conclusion to what he believed had came down from the elders that was ordained by apostolic succession, and ultimately was derived from the Apostle John himself, right? That's the central issue. And Joe thinks that if we start reasoning this way, we actually create a much bigger problem for ourselves as Protestants because, well, we trust Irenaeus on other historical claims too. And so maybe we should kind of pump the brakes of exactly how we're using this argument. And here's Joe listing out that concern.
People like James White and these guys are founders want us to reject apostolic tradition as a reliable source of information and to rely on Scripture alone. But how do we know that the four Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, for example? Only those four. Well, one of the typical arguments you'll hear is that those four were either written by apostles, Matthew and John, or those who accompanied apostles, Mark and Luke. It's a good argument as far as it goes, but the problem is the Gospels themselves are internally anonymous. The authors never introduced themselves. We don't know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from the Bible. We know that from tradition and from tradition alone. And specifically, we know it from traditions recounted by St. Irenaeus and those who come after him. Irenaeus is the first author to name all four of the gospel authors that we have today. The great evangelical scholar D.A. Carson, his commentary on the Gospel of John, acknowledges this, but says that even if Irenaeus, toward the end of the 2nd century, is amongst the strongest, totally unambiguous witnesses, his personal connection with Polycarp, who knew John, means the distance, in terms of personal memories, is not very great. I think Carson is right there. This is what the biblical scholar Marcus Bachmuel calls the period of living memory. In other words, Irenaeus doesn't just know about the authorship of the Gospels from inside the Bible. In fact, he doesn't know it from that at all. Rather, Irenaeus is of the generation of Christians who learned theology, learned about the message of Christianity from bishops and theologians who knew the apostles personally, and who had learned Christianity from the apostles directly. So, for instance, Irenaeus has learned from Polycarp. Polycarp learns from the apostle John. Well, when another of Polycarp's students becomes a Gnostic, Irenaeus refutes him, not by quoting Bible verses to him, but by reminding him that these opinions, those presbyters who preceded us and who were conversant with the apostles, did not hand down to you. As an argument, in other words, from tradition. And he argues that Polycarp would have been horrified to hear Florianus' teachings. So my point here is that if we can't trust Irenaeus, if we cannot trust the early Christians broadly to transmit the gospel correctly, that doesn't just seem to be a big problem for Catholics. That seems to be a major problem for all Christians.
Now, honestly, after Joe said this is where I found myself just asking, Joe, what exactly are we defending here? Like, are we defending Irenaeus' reliability, which I thought was the central concern of the video, or are we defending his infallibility? Because those are two very different things. Look, if Joe's point was simply that Irenaeus was a historical witness, then I would completely agree with him, right? I think Irenaeus is extremely important, right? He's completely reliable. His proximity to Polycarp matters. His proximity to the apostolic generation matters. His testimony about what Christians believe in the 2nd century matters. And I absolutely think Protestants should take him seriously whenever he says things. But at the same time, being reliable does not mean being incapable of error. We know this, right? Reliable people get things wrong all the time. Reliable historians get things wrong. Reliable eyewitnesses get details wrong. And look, when that happens, we don't suddenly say, well, I guess I can't trust this person on anything he's ever said or done. No, we examine that individual's claim and ask whether or not the evidence supports it, right? And so when Irenaeus tells me something about the authorship of the Gospels, for instance, I don't have to say, well, because Irenaeus said it, it must be true, right? I can look at Irenaeus as one piece of historical evidence alongside everything else we have and ask whether or not that claim is just well supported. That's what we can do. That's what we should be doing. And if Irenaeus gets something wrong, that doesn't immediately destroy his usefulness as a witness. It just reminds me that he's a fallible witness, which, again, we all already know. And so that's why I think Joe's argument here is a little strange, if I'm being honest with you, because Joe doesn't believe Irenaeus is infallible either, right? I know this. But functionally, the argument that he presents here starts to sound like questioning one of Irenaeus' claims somehow puts everything else that he's ever said into jeopardy. And I just don't think that follows. I don't have to choose between saying Irenaeus can never be wrong and saying Irenaeus can never be trusted, right? There's a massive category in between those two positions, right? And that category is exactly where Protestants place the church fathers, just as a FYI. We place them in reliable, valuable, historically significant, and guess what? Fallible at the end of the day. And this is actually something that came up in a conversation that I had recently on Cleave to Antiquities podcast, which, by the way, if you haven't seen that conversation, you really should. Basically, I had a conversation, a friendly conversation, might I add, with Father Jonathan. And during that conversation, he actually appealed to St. Basil the Great and argued that Basil identified icon veneration as part of apostolic tradition. And, I was like, okay. And my question basically to him was, all right, so why should I believe Basil on that particular claim? And I didn't mean that disrespectfully. I'm not saying that Basil is worthless as a witness. I'm not saying Basil is even lying either. I'm not saying, why should I ever listen to this guy or anything of that sort. Rather, what I'm asking Father Jonathan there was a historical question. What evidence do I have that this particular thing that St. Basil identifies as apostolic tradition actually goes back to the apostles themselves? Because merely pointing out that somebody said this is a part of apostolic tradition, it tells me that that thing is very important. Sure. It tells me that this person believed it was part of apostolic tradition. I'll grant that. But that is not necessarily the same thing as demonstrating that the apostles actually taught it, that it is actually included in divine revelation itself. Those are two totally different things. And Irenaeus is important precisely because we have an example where he appears to sincerely connect something to apostolic testimony, and yet Joe himself acknowledges that the conclusion that he reached was ultimately wrong. And so, no, I don't think this creates a crisis for gospel authorship, right? I don't think it creates crisis for our ability to use Irenaeus historically at all. It just means that we have to distinguish reliability from infallibility. Again, those are two totally different things. And my friends, I think once we make that distinction, I think Joe's own explanation for how Irenaeus may have got this wrong becomes even more interesting, because I think it actually shows why Protestants are asking for that kind of discernment in the first place. And so here's Joe giving that explanation.
Well, something similar is true back then, and it leads to a lot of confusion when you read ancient authors. It was confusing even between ancient authors. For example, Livy refers to Hannibal as a senex, that's an old man. That's the final stage of life before death. And Hannibal's only 44 years old. Meanwhile, Cicero refers to himself at that age as an adolescent. Look, as a 41-year-old, some days I side with Livy, and some days I side with Cicero. Well, once you know that authors are using the same words in these radically different ways, it should be easy to see where Irenaeus makes an innocent mistake. It's often difficult to tell between ancient authors what they mean by a term like juvenile or old man. In fact, we find this problem even in modern translation of Irenaeus himself. As Chapman points out, Irenaeus talks about being a listener of Polycarp back when he was of age. In Greek, it's helikia. And modern authors often translate that to mean that he was a teenager back then. The Roberts translation that I usually use translates it as happening during Irenaeus' early youth. But that's not what Irenaeus means. For him, helikia refers to a man in his 30s. So that's where the confusion is coming in. Irenaeus is doing the same thing to Papias that modern translators do to him. In other words, he's reading Papias' argument that Jesus lives into full maturity, all the stages of full human life, and Irenaeus applies to that the different ages that he would use to separate those stages of life. And he even makes it pretty clear that's what he's doing. For example, at one point he says, now that the first stage of early life embraces 30 years and that this extends outwards to the 40th year, everyone will admit. But no, that's Irenaeus' error right there. Not everyone does admit that the transition from youth to maturity happens in one's 30s. Most other authors put those stages much earlier. So where does that leave us? Remember, Irenaeus' case for Jesus being in his 40s was built upon two things. A tradition, seemingly from Papias, that Jesus lived through every stage of human life, and from the Gospel of John, where we hear that Jesus is not yet 50. I think most of us would agree that Irenaeus has probably misread both Papias and Scripture, but I don't think that is a particularly strong argument against either tradition or Scripture, or indeed Irenaeus himself, since Irenaeus' interpretations, even when they're mistaken here, were at least sensible and plausible readings. If anything, I think the takeaway here should probably be something like the ancients really should have settled upon the meaning of terms like juvenile and adolescent and old man and spared each other and us a lot of confusion.
Now, when I heard this, I'm just sitting there thinking, Joe, I actually agree with a lot of what you just said there, right? I don't think Irenaeus was being dishonest. I don't think that he was just making things up. I don't think he was being careless, right? His interpretation may have been understandable. We'll grant that. It may have been based on an earlier tradition, right? I'll grant that too. It may have been influenced by how he understood the stages of human life and by how he read John chapter 8. Again, we're granting all of that. But that still leaves us with the same exact problem, right? Because what Joe has basically described is a situation where a tradition is received. A fallible person interprets that tradition through his own categories, right? He reaches the wrong conclusion. And then he sincerely believes that his conclusion reflects what had been handed down through people connected to the apostles who were ordained by the apostles. And my friends, that is exactly why Protestants are just so cautious when somebody says this is apostolic tradition. Again, it's not because we think oral tradition never existed. Obviously, it did. Everything that was later inscripturated was once oral. We get that. It's not because we think the church fathers were all unreliable. No, Christianity would just be a mess if we thought everybody in church history was simply unreliable. We're not stupid. And it's certainly not because we think every appeal to tradition is automatically wrong, right? We don't need to take that position. The Protestant contention is simply that a claim to apostolic tradition in and of itself is not self-authenticating. That's our point, right? That's all we've been trying to communicate to our Catholic and Orthodox counterparts, right? We believe that you still have to ask, well, what exactly was handed down? How early is this testimony? Is the claim independently supported? Is there disagreement among other earlier Christians? Could the person receiving the tradition may have misunderstood it, right? All of these are totally valid questions. Those are not anti-tradition questions. Those are just the kind of questions you ask when you're dealing with fallible historical witnesses. And that's why I ultimately don't think this example creates any real difficulty for the Protestant position in any way, shape, or form, right? I can say Irenaeus was a reliable and extremely valuable witness to the early church, while also saying that he was capable of misidentifying or even misunderstanding something he believed had apostolic roots. Those are not exclusively mutual claims. And look, if Joe agrees with that, then I'm not sure what part of the Protestant concern has been ultimately refuted, because the concern for us was never Irenaeus got this one thing wrong, therefore throw out all tradition. The concern was if a church father can sincerely connect an erroneous conclusion to what he believes came from the apostles, then I think merely saying the fathers tell us that this is apostolic cannot settle the question by itself. That is all we're saying. We believe that we still need discernment. And I think Joe's own explanation of Irenaeus actually gives us a really good example as to why we need that discernment. And so, look, at the end of the day, I don't think Joe's video gives Protestants a reason to stop using this example, especially whenever we're talking about apostolic tradition and why we should be really cautious and why we shouldn't think it's just infallible whenever we're talking to Catholics and Orthodox. If anything, I think we just need to use this example more carefully. I think Joe made that point very good, right? Irenaeus getting something wrong does not mean that Irenaeus is useless. It doesn't mean that the church fathers cannot preserve apostolic teaching. It doesn't even mean that oral tradition didn't even exist. And it certainly doesn't mean that we should just ignore church history altogether. But it does mean that when somebody in church history says this came from the apostles, we don't just simply accept it blindly and just say, oh, okay, yeah, they must have known what they were talking about. No, they could have gotten this thing wrong. They could have been mistaken. That claim still needs to be examined. Merely pointing out that somebody believed that this is a part of apostolic tradition, as we see with Irenaeus, doesn't really get us very far, right? All it does is it tells us that there were people at that particular time that thought this was part of apostolic tradition and that thought this was very important. That's it, right? And that distinction really matters here, right? I can believe Irenaeus is reliable without believing he is infallible. I have to repeat that multiple times because I think this is something people just need to understand, right? I can believe St. Basil is an incredible, important witness to early Christianity without automatically accepting every single claim that Basil identifies as apostolic tradition. And I can take tradition seriously without treating every appeal to tradition as self-authenticating. Again, we shouldn't do that with anything. We should test everything, as the Apostle Paul says. And that's really all I and every other Protestant is asking for. And so when Joe says, well, if you question Irenaeus here, what about the Gospels? My answer is, look, I evaluate Irenaeus' gospel claim on its own evidence, just like I evaluate this claim on its own evidence too. And so when Joe explains how Irenaeus may have misunderstood an earlier tradition, my response is exactly. That's why discernment is necessary, because fallible people can receive true things and misunderstand them. We know this. They can preserve things accurately in one place and inaccurately in another. They can sincerely believe something came from the apostles and still be mistaken about what was actually handed down by the apostles. And so the question is not whether or not tradition exists. The question is whether a particular claim to apostolic tradition has actually been demonstrated. And I don't think Joe's response removes that question. I think, if anything, his explanation shows us why we still need to ask it. But anyways, guys, look, that's the video. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. I would love to engage with my Catholics and Orthodox on this issue. As always, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, as it really does help the channel out a lot. And until next time, guys, peace.